Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Husqvarna Viking, keeping the world sewing for over 140 years. Hi, and welcome to Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community. I'm Mary Kate Karr-Petras, and I'm joined today in our little interview set by Kath Wright, who is Quilters Newsletter's senior designer. Welcome, Kath.
Thank you.
If you read Quilters Newsletter, then you know that we dedicate the last page of each issue to what we call photo finish, and it's a place for us to showcase just a really spectacular, eye-catching, wonderful quilt that we want to share with you. And for June, July 2015, we dedicated our photo finish to a quilt made by Kath, which she called Blaze. And so we're here today to talk about her design process and how she came to make this really stunning, beautiful, original quilt. Thank you, Kath.
Thank you.
Let's start with where this quilt started.
Well, in one of our earlier Best Weekend Quilts magazines, we were all supposed to pick a quilt and make a version of it for ourselves.
I think that was my bright idea, and then everybody else did a really great job with their weekend quilts. But
and I ended up choosing a quilt called Triangles and Diamonds, and I actually made it at about half size of the one that was in the magazine, and used a completely different colorway.
So let's just show this really quick. So this is what the original quilt looked like.
And there was I had made a photo mock-up of a different color version, and that was sort of the basis that I started with to make my version of that quilt.
And this was in late 2013, right?
Yes,
fall.
It came out in July or something.
Oh, okay.
Of 2013. So that was where I started to do my version of the quilt. And I completed the assignment that we needed to do and had the complete background of the quilt started. And I didn't have a lot of motivation to finish it right then. I mean, I could have finished it and thrown it on the back of the couch, and I just didn't really need to. And I often need motivation or some, brilliant idea to motivate me to go further. So at the time, one of my nephews was going through some medical issues and so forth, and I live many states away from most of my family, and again was thinking about what could I do to show my support other than just letting him know that. And I started thinking about the triangle and diamond background of this quilt, and the fact that it was kind of spiky and had those kinds of points and things going on. And it made me think of his pet bearded dragon, whose name is Blaze. And I thought, this might be a real opportunity to turn that little quilt, a start of a quilt, into something really spectacular. So I asked he and his mother for a photograph of Blaze, and they ended up sending me the perfect photograph. I had envisioned having the head of the lizard at the bottom of the quilt and somehow wrapping his tail up on the background. So they sent me this wonderful photograph and gave me a basis to start with. So I took that.
I just have to note, he's on a leash.
Yes, I know, and it cracks me up because he's only about, 12 inches long or something. So the photograph has him on a leash. But I took that photograph, and I work a lot with photographs for my landscape quilts and things, and I only use photographs that are my own photographs. It just seems more a better starting place for me. And then I take great liberty with those photographs. I don't like to try to reproduce something exactly as the photograph registers it. I like to take the design and make an outline drawing, get the very specific details, and then work on the design wall.
What do you use to to trace it or to make the illustration based on a photo? Do you computer, paper, and pencil?
I've done both, but in this case, I have a computer and I have Adobe Illustrator at home. And so I scanned in the photograph, or took the photograph as it was and plopped it on my page, made a template, and then did an outline drawing of what I estimated were the key elements. And those are the things that I really wanted to get right about how the legs are attached, the head, how the very specific details that make something work. And then I also sort of took the tail and wrapped it because I wanted it to appear a certain way on the quilt. So I worked with that, made just a small drawing, and then blew it up on the computer to the size it needed to be for the quilt.
Which is how large?
Well, the quilt finished with borders and everything at about 54 by 60 inches. So then I took that file to a local FedEx Kinko place and had them output it to full size, because working at a full size template is just, it was wonderful that they can do that.
Right.
And they can output it on one sheet of paper. It was big enough or small enough to output directly on a sheet of paper. So that became the thing that I worked with as my overall template.
Okay.
And then the process, at this point in the process, I had just that original background quilt to work with. It hadn't been quilted, I hadn't added borders or anything
Yeah,
else.
I see that. It was just the simple quilt top at this point.
Exactly. So I trimmed and pinned the dragon shape and just sort of loosely pinned it onto that background so I could start auditioning other fabrics on top of that. And I was trying to look for lots of fabrics. I had pulled a number of things that had sort of those spiky details.
These are some of the samples that you brought.
Right, and in that case, I'm looking for things that have a lot of contrast, sort of a lot of lizard-like details and things that are kind of feathery, because once you cut into those, I thought they would be real expressive as far as choices.
And you don't even you haven't cut any shapes yet. You're just pinning fabric
Exactly.
on the design wall, on the template, to sort of see how it plays together.
Right.
Okay.
And for me, it's really hard to tell how much contrast and whether or not the colors are looking good without having them pinned up on the wall. And then standing back, I typically also take photographs as I go, because somehow when I look in the back of the camera, it distills that color information in a way that I can't really see by eye. So I'll go through the process of trying that with any number of fabrics and pin things up, step back, look at them, take a photo often, because that also records it for me later. If I make a change and want to go back, I'll see something that I've tried to tested that didn't really read well or read better than what I'm dealing with next.
So all these photos that we have are not because you were planning a tutorial, it's because this is your process.
Exactly. This is how I work on a regular basis. It's how I edit, it's how I decide something is working and not working.
Got it.
So then I start doing a little bit more fine-tuning, and at the next stage, I've already got the head determined and the eye pieces. And when I saw this fabric, I determined that it was perfect for the shape of the eye of the dragon. And so I ended up using that. That pretty much nailed it. And in order to actually go from there, from those choices, to making a template that's going to work for that part of it. I'm ready to commit to that color arrangement and everything for the head and for the eyepiece and for the little area on the side of the dragon that holds that. I then go back to the design wall and to my oversized template and make an additional tracing that has no seam allowance, but I make a tracing that I can actually, on freezer paper, that I can actually put onto the fabric and cut out with some seam allowance, and then I've got that part taken care of, and I'll pin that back on the wall. So that's what I've done in the next photo, is to start defining certain places. Yeah. And I worked first with the head because that's the primary focal point. That's where the most interest is and where I'm going to have the most detail. And so once I got that figured out and got the body fabric and the, which I have just scraps of now, I chose this for the main head and the body, and the striped fabric for the tail.
That fabric's fantastic.
Which worked out really well.
Yeah, it's a great choice.
So once I committed to those pieces, I started working out from there. So all of the ruffling that's on the edges and the spiky parts, I started working out from there. And it took me, again, auditioning a number of fabrics to get something that works. And at this point, everything is still just pinned to the wall, and as I audition something, if I like it, I go on. If I don't, I have to look at other things.
How long did this stage take? I mean, a couple days,
this
couple weeks?
Can sometimes, I make the most progress with it on a Saturday or Sunday on the weekend, and so, I can, just auditioning the fabric and committing and so forth can take anywhere from a couple hours to, a couple days to make my decisions about things. Then I'll stop and actually make real templates for those parts.
Okay.
And work out from there.
Okay.
So progressively, once I had the head and some of the ruffling starting to work and the side pieces, I went ahead and trimmed the body and the tail, and didn't applique them down, but had them pinned up, trimmed with seam allowance for doing my final applique. And I do work, on the applique parts, I do all needle turned applique edges.
Hand applique.
So hand applique. So all of that, I've always got to be working in the seam allowance, making sure that I'm doing enough, and working in parts and pieces that need to be attached to the next piece, or can wait until later for finishing. So I'm still making lots of changes and making lots of decisions about what fabric is going to go where and what one is going to read the best. And then once I felt pretty committed to the head shape and to the side, I started working on the legs.
Okay.
Because in some cases they would need to be actually sewn together before another part could be attached.
So there's a lot of thinking ahead, thinking where you are in the entire process. It seems like it really has to evolve in a sort of an organic sense. It's not real straightforward necessarily. There's a lot of thinking, and you just let it take place over time. You don't rush yourself, because that would interrupt your artistic flow. So.
Well, and also because I do hand applique and everything, there are a lot of times when I have to stop and take it off the wall and work on that part, then put it back up because it's ready for the next edition of pieces.
So here we see even more adding the legs, the front.
Yeah,
and for the front legs.
And for each of those things, I was auditioning fabric as I got to that point. And because I work in a way where I'm working mostly from scrap fabrics, I have a limited amount of each one.
Yeah.
So I keep everything, all the scraps I have, as I go, so that I can use them on an additional part of the the lizard.
Many, many iterations of different things.
Yes.
So let's jump forward to after the whole thing was appliqued, or you had the whole thing finished and you appliqued on. Did you add the borders after you appliqued it? Yes, it must have been because you were working on the applique as you went.
Yes. After I got it all, the lizard pretty well complete, then I took him off of the wall and off of the quilt. And then I figured out how I was going to finish the borders, because what I wanted to do was finish the entire quilt back and quilt it before I added the lizard applique.
Ah, I see.
Because I wanted the quilting that was on the base quilt to be just sort of geometric lines.
I see.
And I wanted the quilting that was going to end up being on the dragon and everything to be very specific to the applique part.
I see.
And there were good things and bad things that happened out of that plan.
Well, and you've had fun with the borders, that's for sure.
Yes, and I finally, I did have to sort of go in and do that as a drawing, because I only had a certain amount of border fabric. So I auditioned it and cut it just straight borders to start with.
Mm-hmm.
Then I went to the drawing table and figured out how to put some insets in so that I would have a more interesting, background.
Again, the spikiness,
Right.
sort of that jaggedness, jagged points that you were talking about, carries it out into the borders as well.
And repeated some of the same fabrics that were used within the quilt. So there's the dragon off, and
Here he is on.
then in this one he's just laid, the applique is laid back on top of the quilt, which has now been finished and bound. And then the tricky part was really doing the applique of the final pieces
I was going to
on
ask.
that.
Because again, you did it by
quilt.
hand.
I did it by hand.
And you just had to go through just that top layer.
Right.
Without catching the batting.
And
Through batiks.
right, and some of the pieces, you'll notice on some of the detail photography, the claws they're also folded edged, hand appliqued, and I left them I had everything else on there except the toes appliqued down. So where I inserted those. And if you've done a hand applique, you know that you're having to bunch things up so that you can do fine stitching. And I had not considered the fact that that was going to be almost impossible at that stage, but it worked out.
It worked
fine.
out. It worked out. So then that was the last stage then, the hand applique
and then
on the quilt.
And then the quilting of the
course, right.
dragon. And the other thing about the quilting of the dragon that I hadn't anticipated until I'd ripped out a number of stitches is I do trim back under the applique some, but there were a lot of places that when I started doing free motion quilting, it would immediately snag on some of those joins, because there's a lot of areas where there's several layers of fabric, as well as the whole rest of the quilt being quilted. And after getting really frustrated doing that, I finally realized that I could mark my quilting just with chalk or whatever. And that's what I did. I sort of highlighted the areas that I knew. I went through and just by feel.
I see.
I could highlight those areas that I knew were going to be problematic, that the machine's just going to give up there. And by avoiding those, I had no problem, but it took me a while to get there. So,
Little trial and error. Well, as I said in the intro, we reserve photo finish for spectacular quilts. And when you brought this in to share, because we always do show and tell. Whenever we finish something, we have to bring it into show and tell, and you brought it in, and we just said, well, we have to use this somehow, and photo finish was the perfect place for it.
Well, it was really a thrill to have something of mine make it into the photo finish.
Well, you did us a favor by bringing us something perfect for it. And what did your nephew think of the quilt?
Oh, he loves it. It's perfect.
Excellent.
And I wanted to make it so that he could actually either use it on the bed or wrap up in it or hang it on the wall. My quilts are meant to be used however the recipient intends. So.
Excellent. Well, that's the fine coda too. A wonderful story. To see your own copy, get your own copy of June-July 2015 issue to see Kath's quilt, Blaze. Thank you again so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. We look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye. Quilters Newsletter TV, the Quilters community, is brought to you by Husqvarna Viking, keeping the world sewing for over 140 years.